Eric, I guess we're going to talk a lot today about unlocking that untapped data that people find in the business. And we know we've got some great topics and I made a guarantee last night that people will learn something from our chat today. So no pressure on either of us to do that. But do you want to start by telling everybody who you are, what you do, and why you're here today talking about data?
No, for sure. And thanks a lot for having me, Scott. This should be a lot of fun. Yeah, so my name is Derek Smith. I'm with Canopy Metrics. And essentially what I've set out to do with Canopy Metrics is help primarily restaurants use their data more effectively to make more profit. So that sounds a little lofty, but restaurants especially are sitting on some of the millions of points of data. And so when I hear people saying, I can't make profit. I don't know how to make more profit. We're going to have to go out of business. It's like, stop, let's take a look at the information that you have and see if there's a way that we can, help kind of squeeze the lemon a little bit more. So that's primarily what I do.
Yeah, we see that. I see that all the time with my clients as well. The amount of data that kind of sits around there that can be the best tool in the locker, so to speak, and it's just not used, not utilized. People kind of don't use it as a benchmark. It's amazing to see that happens so often, even in today's world, where people are becoming so much more tech savvy. Right? It's a funny one where there seems to be no correlation in the industry between being using tech to advance what you're doing versus kind of continuing to do it the same way that we've always done it in the past.
It's funny. I use an analogy quite often that data in businesses is kind of like, or data utilization is kind of like, somebody telling you to go to the gym because it'll make you feel better and you'll live longer, right? We hear that all the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know, sometimes it's just that feeling where it's like, okay, I get it. I get it. Yes, sure. I'll be healthier if I go to the gym, and some people still don't. So, it's the same sort of thing with data in restaurants. There's so much money just sitting there waiting to be captured. And, you just got to kind of press the go button, right?
For sure, definitely. So, what are the biggest challenges that you face every day? Because the data is there. A lot of the time, people don't understand how to use it. Sometimes people are scared of the results. So, what is it that you struggle, or what is it that your clients struggle with every day that you kind of fix that problem for them?
Yeah, I look at it through two different lenses. I think when I was working in organizations, as a full-time employee, I think one of the most difficult challenges with data utilization is that there is a period of time where you have to make sure that the data is accurate, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure we've all heard of the term data, garbage in, garbage out. It's a big problem. If your data is not set up to be utilized, it can't be utilized, right? So, unfortunately, there is a period of time that may be longer or shorter depending on, how your data is set up, where you have to go through that sort of initial step of getting things organized first, and then you can start to, unleash the power of the data, right? So that's, I think, challenging for some owners and operators, because there is a waiting period, and that's unfortunate. But I would say the second thing too, with regards to being in an organization and utilizing data, is that you have to make sure that the team that you're showing that information to can understand it, and they don't necessarily need to have a translator at all times to help them look at a report and understand what's happening. So definitely the perspective that I always come from is trying to create intuitive dashboards where a GM, a junior manager with very little experience can come in and look at it and say, okay, I see what's happening here, right? From the lens of doing what I do now, which is trying to like work with clients, so as on the kind of consulting end, I think the most challenging thing is that data is not sexy. Like, no, when I'm posting about it, when I'm talking about it, I try not to even use the word data because I don't want people's eyes to gloss over. So it's very hard to be so passionate about how much it can help a business, but then not be able to talk about it,
Yeah.
in a very sort of passionate way. So it's
Yeah.
challenging for sure.
I mean, it's a results business as well, right? Because when you're looking at data, you're analyzing data and you're unlocking You're unlocking things that are sitting there waiting, answers waiting to be told. I guess it's then about implementation, and it's how you can help guide people through that process. And I think, when I go into businesses as well, and look at how we can make instant impact into that business, is the data I use first, and then we use those decisions to help us implement ideas and kind of get that buy-in from the teams, get that connection, because we're not coming in with the opinion. And I've seen you use before, do with, not do for. That's exactly how data can help people be successful in implementation, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's the opinion thing is very interesting, and I find our industry, the restaurant industry, is there's still a lot of players, especially at the executive level, that would prefer to use intuition over data to make decisions. And I've worked with some extremely successful, extremely effective executives that have used intuition for 20 or 30 years to build their business. So it's not to say that that isn't powerful, but imagine having utilizing intuition with data, to confirm that your intuition is correct. And that's the way that I always start with any sort of data analysis: is have a hypothesis and then try and prove or deny the hypothesis. And that's where I think it can be extremely powerful, is working with someone who's been in the industry for 30 years. They know in their gut what should work, and then we can just prove that it will work, right? And help sort of confirm that, or say, hey, no, I don't think this is the right move for these reasons, right?
Yeah, I see it a lot with teams, and I have done over the past in operations, where they'll tell you that something's the best seller on the menu, and it's probably because they sold 2 or 3 that day, and it's kind of fresh in mind. And when you go to the sales mix, it tells you something completely different. And it's always one of those conversations that I have with people when we start talking about menu engineering and menu mixes. Is let's back it up with the sales mix. Let's pull that sales mix off and let's see what the data is telling us, because it's not the thing that kind of lies. It's not the thing that takes into account what's been happening in the last 24 hours, kind of fresh in mind. It's very factual in terms of what's been taken. So it's back to your example of how you back up intuition, you back up decisions with the data that sits there as a process of kind of acknowledgement in terms of moving forwards, I think. So it's very, very similar in terms of, and when we first met, our kind of two lives kind of cross over in very similar ways, in that mine's very operational, but we do it with a data-driven basis, and yours is very much focused on the data to get that operational efficiency out at the other side as well, isn't it? So it just shows how it can intermingle in terms of what different people do. So I guess we promised that, or I promised, should I say, that we would share some untapped metrics that operators aren't using in the business. And to be honest, when we were having our chat before and we were preparing for this, it wasn't too difficult to get a fair few of these stacked up in the back to decide which ones to use on the stream today. But I know there was 2 that we kind of both felt were the most important and potentially quite simple for operators to take what data is there already and implement that into their business moving forward. So should we dive in and start talking about those 2 areas in terms of the untapped metrics that are sitting in the businesses?
Let's get into it. Yeah, I'd love to share. Yeah. If you're okay, I'll start with one of the big ones that we chatted with. What I will say right off the bat is that a lot of businesses that I've worked with or spoken to, when it comes to performance measurement and metric utilization, I would say that 99% of companies will have revenue metrics everywhere: covers, revenue, average check, and then very few will have like detailed labor metrics, and then even fewer will have food cost metrics, which is very interesting. I think we'll get into that in a little bit. But these particular ways of utilizing data are fairly unique but extremely powerful. So one that I use regularly is something called an index. And I'm going to try and explain this. I do have a visual if we want to look at it, but I'll try and explain this as best I can. Um, I think most people are familiar with the way that a stock market works. And when you look at like the Dow Jones Industrial Average, anything, TSX, they're all based off of something called an index. And the way that an index works is that there's like a starting point. So let's say with week 1, 2023 is our index period, right? What we can start to do is we can start to compare the changes week to week to week to that index period, right? And where this becomes very valuable is when you have something like covers, and then you have labor, and then you have average check, and you have all of these, measures that actually don't really, like, you can't, when you put them on a graph, they're going to be on separate lines because they're so different, right? You might have 2,000 covers, but your average check is 23 and a half, right? To
Yeah.
put that on the same chart can be very difficult. But when you start to index values, it makes it very easy to like normalize your data across a certain span of time. And you can start to see how your data starts to correlate with each other on a graph. So I don't know if that was like a good way to sort of explain that, but I use indexes in like so many ways. You can take every major element of your income statement. So let's say your revenue component, your labor component, food cost, manage your controllable costs, and then your profit. Put them on an index, and you'll be able to see pretty quickly which one of your income statement elements is affecting profit the most and has like the highest correlative value to profit decline or profit increase, right? So yeah, it's very, very powerful.
And I find this fascinating because it is interesting that as a business we don't use it because we're quite emotional to an extent. And by looking at indexes, it kind of takes that emotion of almost real life numbers out of the equation and starts looking at trends and graphs. And I guess, when we went through it the other day, and I know you have a sheet that might be interesting just to share with people, is that kind of visual aspect makes it much easier for people to understand, even if the index piece potentially might be a little bit complicated to put together for the average person. From an understanding point of view, it becomes really easy, doesn't it? And it becomes a lot less emotional because you're not seeing big numbers and big drops and kind of correlating that in your mind before you do results.
Totally true. Yeah. And I'll share maybe this visual just in 30 seconds here. What I will say, at the beginning, I was talking about creating intuitive charts, right? A lot of the reporting mechanisms that we use in the restaurant industry, whether it's from software companies or ones that are built, customized internally, I just find that they don't provide answers. They provide a lot of information. And then it's up to an owner or a member of the executive team or an operator to be able to interpret that, right? So what I try and do is build visualizations that like are automatically intuitive, and that's what I find indexes can provide. So I don't know if you want me to maybe just share really quickly, Scott, like an
Yeah, for
example of
sure.
that.
Yeah, I think it'd be
Okay.
good. I always talk, about 2018. I was managing operations across 4 different countries, and we had multiple different tech systems in place when we were doing it. And one of the things that was a real game changer for me in terms of managing the operation effectively was when we did use a system that pulled everything together and consolidated data into one. And what it meant was our managers went to one place to analyze results instead of going into a pod system that half the time they don't have access to because people don't like them fiddling around with the back end, into the labor system, the payroll system, the reviews dashboard, X, Y, Z. And we started using Tenzon, and I know you spoke to Christian, the founder, from an intro that I did. And what we found was by looking at data in graphs, looking at data as a consolidation, made it much easier for the operation to see it. But also because we made it so easy by going into one place, it became much more accessible and much more valuable to the team because they weren't having to remember 6 different passwords, the different systems they would on, work out how to use them. So that whole piece that you were saying about kind of consolidation, bringing things into data that's easily understandable, can have huge impact on the operation just purely by changing a chart into a graph, right?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, no, definitely. It's a huge, I'd like to get into that actually in a little bit more detail, later on, because it's a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge for the industry, and typically where people, you know, kind of leave the idea of data analytics when you're talking about creating data warehouses and
Yeah,
consolidating information, right? So
yeah, big time.
yeah, really quickly, I don't want to hold this up on the screen
Yep.
because, but this is an example of what I was recommending. So this is a labor index. And as you can see here, we have covers. This blue line is covers. And we've indexed all of the following weeks here off of week one. So week one, let's just give it a value of 1, and then week 2, depending on what the value is, you divide it by week 1, and it shows you, how week 2 relates to week 1, and that's how this looks, right? So what I'm going to just do really quickly is just show you if I were to take covers, total hours, and labor cost and put each of these on the chart, we should start to see some really interesting information here. So the colors are a little bit poor here, but total labor hours is in dark blue, covers is in light blue, and labor cost is in orange here. So one thing that I can notice when you look towards the end here is that as our covers start to increase and our total labor hours are declining, we can see a correlative effect to labor cost percentage, right? So what this is showing is the relationship between the total number of labor hours and the total number of people in our restaurant, right? So obviously, if we have slight growth in the people coming into our restaurant, but that's and we have a slight decline in the number of total labor hours that we're using to service those customers, it's fairly intuitive to know that we will have a decrease in our labor cost percentage. And conversely, when we look at our covers going down, but our labor staying a little bit higher on this index, we see an increase in our labor cost percentage. So I don't know if you have any further questions about that, but like that is the basis of how an index works, is that these values like covers, total hours, and labor cost percentage, if you put these on the same chart, if you tried to, you wouldn't even be able to have, like, their scale is just so different. So an index allows you to put multiple different metrics on the same chart to see the correlative effects. And I'll just add one more really quick thing. This is actually very helpful as well when you're trying to normalize information across multiple different restaurants. So for instance, if you have 20 restaurants in your business, but they all have different revenue values, you're able to normalize the profitability and the costs of your restaurants based on an index, right? So it helps a lot in that regard.
Yeah, it's
I
really
could go on
useful,
forever, but I'm pretty sure nobody wants to sit and stare at a line graph for the entire day. But yeah, it's powerful.
No, it's really valuable, isn't it? And it's one again where you were saying about kind of taking multiple stores and putting them into one and looking at the index. It really does help you see where there might be an anomaly within the estate in terms of where peaks and troughs may come. And there's so many variables that go into labor cost, and we're going to come on to that a little bit later that will help understand why this is so important in terms of looking at labor costs very differently, isn't it, as well, in terms of productivity over labor costs, which I know you're a big believer in. So number 2, then we talked about basket of goods, and people might look at this and watching the stream and might think that we're crazy to say that it's an untapped data metric. But I think we've both had experiences of going into businesses that just don't look at basket of goods and don't look at food cost effectively or even at all. So why is this such a great metric to pull in every hospitality business?
Well, there couldn't be a better point in time to talk about the value of a basket of goods than the years here following COVID. The cost of goods right now is insane. I think in Canada we've had an average of 8% increase I think it was 12 at one point in time, 12% increase in cost of goods, which is just mind-boggling when you think about the impact to restaurant profitability. Hard part from a restaurant's perspective is it's very hard to know when you should accept the cost increase and how much, and when you should push back against a supplier. I think that there has been scenarios, and not just in the restaurant industry, I think just overall, where businesses have taken advantage of this moment in time where people are just kind of throwing their hands up and saying, just charge me whatever you want. We're getting grocery stores here in Canada, they're getting in a lot of trouble for increasing the price of goods far beyond what the market is actually increasing at, right?
Yeah.
But how do you know, right? So this is where basket of goods comes in. So as an owner, you have a purchasing team, let's say, and you want to ask your purchaser, how are we doing? And the purchaser says, we're doing good. Okay. That's not a performance metric. That's an opinionated, viewpoint on as to like how your purchasing team is doing. Basket of goods allows you to have a very specific metric that can show the success of your purchasing team. So how is this created? Well, I can speak about how we do it in Canada from a national perspective. We have something called the Canadian Price Index, or Consumer Price Index is probably the easiest way to look at CPI, right? So what we do here is the government will take a basket of general goods in a grocery store, and they'll add up the price of that basket. Okay, it'll be like soap and like milk and all these things. So they have this basket price, and then they index it, just like we were talking about. And then, for each of the kind of following years and months, they'll compare the price of that basket back to the index period. So that's how they figure out the national, increase in prices for specific categories. And they actually break down in Canada, it's StatsCan, they break down the price or the basket of goods into categories. So you can actually have like wholesale food as a category, right? So that's amazing for us when we're looking to look at the success of our purchasing team, because for a lot of restaurants, they have a general basket of goods. They have romaine lettuce, iceberg lettuce, butter, cheese, like things that are just going to be there for the next 20 years, right? If you break those items down into their lowest unit of measure, like per pound pricing, and then add up all of those prices for your basket of goods, you have your own basket of goods, and then index it. And now you can start to compare your price index to the national average, right? And that's how, and I've done this before, where we would be able to see what's our purchasing power looking like compared to the national average. I don't know if that's easy to sort of visualize, but that's the basic idea of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I understand. I think, we were talking earlier about a supplier that is working with one of our clients, and they've worked with him for 10 years, and they want to test the market, but they're not really sure about whether they actually want to move suppliers. So we said to them, let's benchmark against other suppliers, other competitors. And if you don't want to leave him because you have such a great relationship, use that as a tool to go and make sure that he's delivering you the competitive prices, and use that to open a conversation in a respectful and open way to go, listen, we see the market is delivering cheaper prices. Where can we get to? Because we don't want to leave you, but we need to protect our bottom line. And it's another way, isn't it, to try and if it's not on the price, the consumer price index, if that's just on other suppliers that are there, and you go through a normal pricing process, there's such opportunity around finding ways to get reviews on your basket and using them to have conversations with your current suppliers to help kind of defend that efficiency. And it's one of those where if you never challenge price, naturally everyone becomes comfortable, prices start getting pushed, and all of a sudden list prices don't get discounted and things like that. It's it's things we see every day. So it's about using that opportunity to go out there and use the data that's in the market to be able to help your business improve. And that's probably where people aren't using that basket of goods metric effectively, right?
Yeah, I agree. And what I found, I worked specifically in purchasing for 5 years, and as an analyst, and the team that I was working with they use these types of metrics all the time, and they were the ones who put that pressure on themselves to use that information. And what it did was it made our team extremely effective, because we were always looking to try and maintain our success with regards to our basket of goods versus the national average, right? That was a metric that we used to measure our own performance. And without that, I mean, how else do you how else do you, as a purchaser, show that you were successful? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, obviously, to say, hey, we negotiated this new contract. But to me, it seems like one of the best ways to be able to show your effectiveness, your purchasing team's effectiveness, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. So in terms of, if we move on, and I think we covered some great ones there. People are using data. People are using data in the businesses. But sometimes maybe because, and I know the two we're going to look at now are metrics that over the last kind of 24 months, I've probably learned to look at more closely. And a lot of that reason is because previously metrics have always been done the traditional way: revenue, average daily sales, food cost, labor cost, percentage. And it's always been the same way, but there's definitely better ways to do it. So we've kind of come up with two metrics now that, if we were to set them up a little bit differently, could probably generate, or likely to generate, much stronger results and much more accurate results for the business. So should we go into which ones we've kind of picked out in terms of that? And the first one is food cost variance, which is definitely one that I've picked up over the last couple of years, in terms of, a budget is only as good as the budget signed off. And normally a budget is very opinionated. A lot of the time, it's when it gets pushed upstairs, it gets pushed back downstairs for what they believe something should look like. And if your team can't influence what they buy, they can't influence the price they buy it at, they can't influence the sales mix or what is going on to the menu, it's not very fair to manage them against budget, right?
I agree. Yeah, but budgeting is a very interesting time of the year when you work on the sort of analyst side, right? I love helping groups set budgets. It seems a little weird, but you a lot of hospitality groups have, let's say 4 or 5 accountants who have looked at numbers for 12 months in a row, consistently sort of consolidating data and looking at the profit picture and all this. And then finally, one time in the year, they have this amazing opportunity to get involved in the budgeting, procedure and help groups set budgets, which is so funny, because what happens is accounting analysts will say, this is our prediction. This is what we think based on these variables. It's very data driven. This is, and then what happens a lot is it goes up to the top, comes back from an executive meeting, and the executive's like, yeah, no, I think that that's not going to work for us. And,
yeah,
and for a lot of reasons that maybe aren't as objective, or things that we haven't thought about, like, putting too much stress on the operators or whatever it may be. So anyway, it's a little bit of an aside, but I tend to really enjoy the budgeting process. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? For sure. And that food cost variance, then talk a little bit more about this and how that can help a business.
Yeah, food cost variance. If there was one metric on a restaurant's P&L that I like the most and have the most amount of experience with, it's food cost variance. I'll just provide like a little story really quick. When I was working with one group, we just could not seem to lower the food cost value, right? So there was, as many people on, that are watching this might know, there's the theoretical food cost, then there's what you actually spent, and the difference between what you actually spent and what you theoretically should have spent is the variance, right? So what was happening is we were looking at our actual food cost percentage, and it kept climbing, and we couldn't figure out why. So naturally, like, as an analyst, I come in and I look at value and I say, what are the variables that are affecting the actual food cost percentage? There's the theoretical and then there's the variance, right? And theoretical, when you think about how that number is generated, that is very much under the control of the head office, right? You're looking at menu pricing decisions, purchasing decisions. That's basically what makes up the theoretical. So let's take that, which is a metric or a value that really is very hard for a chef to control, and push it to the side and say, that is not what we need you to focus on. There's not anything you can really do in that regard to influence theoretical food costs. What we do need you to focus on is the food cost variance, right? And that's what I like about the food cost variance is that, I felt when I was working with this one group that I was helping the chefs, I was kind of on their team and saying, hey, listen, I know you can't control that. So when you have an 8% increase in your cost of goods in a year, that's going to have a significant impact on your theoretical, which makes your actual go up. And so even if you're running a very tight variance, your actual is still going to go up. And then your owner's going to say, what is going on here, guys? We need you to do better. Put that to the side. What we are going to focus on is variance. And variance, if you use the right software, can be extremely powerful. It's one of those things, I talk a lot about like actionable insights, because ultimately that's what people need. And there's software out there. There's so many amazing pieces of software. A lot of people would recognize like MarketMan, Crunch Time, Optimum Control. These pieces of software will tell you exactly what items, ingredient items you're variant on, right? So like when you talk about actual insights, it's like, oh, our variance is up by, a half a percentage point. Why? You go look at the software that you have and it'll say lettuce, cheese, milk, butter, whatever it is. And then, as a chef, you can say, okay, so what I'm going to do is put my this sous chef in charge of these 10 items that are our highest variance items. And then I'm going to put this sous chef on these 10 items that are the highest variance items. And I want you to report back to me every week on what we're doing to try and reduce the variance on those items. There, that's your actionable insight, right? Yeah.
Oh, there we go. And I think what's interesting there is exactly what you were saying. Is it's about using the right metrics to the right people, right? So when you're talking to the chef, so if you're the owner, if you're the senior operator, the chef, you're talking food cost variance. The purchasing manager, you're talking about theoretical, and you're having two very focused conversations on two people who can affect the metric that you're managing or leading the business with, right? It's important that you're doing it with the right person, because I know I've been sat in conversations before. I use food cost variance and theoretical, and the first time you have a conversation with the ops manager, the chef, it's we can't, everything we're buying is too expensive. The menu isn't priced high enough. There's all these conversations that mean actually meetings don't end up productive because there's too many what ifs attached to them, and that's where that food cost variance can make such a difference, can't it? It's so powerful. I'm doing it with a client at the minute. We go on every week onto a call with the accountant. We bring up the stock system. We look down the variance, and we start looking at what the big ticket items are, and looking at why that might happen. And sometimes it's a missed invoice. Sometimes it's the yield isn't right. The wastage isn't right. But it's so important, and it's back to that garbage in, garbage out as well into the business, right? It's so important, and if people are being managed or kind of the performance is being based upon those metrics, they become much more responsible for what goes into the system as well.
I totally agree with you, Scott. Like that's the whole, on the garbage in, garbage out piece, right? What I found to be the most surprising now that, I'm sort of on my own and working with groups and talking with groups quite a bit. I can't believe how many groups don't have, their theoretical food costs calculated. To me, like, that's like the lowest possible hanging fruit. It's like, when we talk about profitability and being competitive and increased cost of sale and all these things, if you're not tracking your food costs, like that is like, I don't know how you're going to remain competitive, right? Like if your competitor down the street is tracking their food costs and they're keeping their variance to within like 1.5, points, but you don't even track your theoretical. First of all, you don't know what's contributing the most on your menu. So how are you making any menu decisions, right?
Yeah.
They're all based on opinion. Then like how are you judging the success of your chefs? Like it's mind-blowing to me. And for very little investment, and given the power of some of these tools that are available, you could be calculating it within 2 weeks, So yeah,
Yeah.
I find that very surprising.
And in terms of that variance percentage, then, so on food cost variance, what would you say was an industry kind of metric or variance that if someone's watching this, they have the tools in place to pull the variance, and might be doing it on a basis anyway, but not necessarily tracking it to the fullest. What would you say that percentage should be in terms of a weekly variance?
I based on the experience that I have and the groups that I've worked with, I think that number is probably around 1.5 to 2%.
Yeah.
If it's higher than that, then there's probably some operational controls that need to be put in place and some good analysis to be done. If it's lower than 1%, I think that you really need to evaluate the yields that you have in your recipe software, and also the portioning, from the culinary team. All right.
Yeah.
That was one of the scariest things that we realized when it came to the actual food cost percentage before we started analyzing food cost variance, is that chefs had no idea how they were going to influence that number, right? So what naturally would happen if your owner's yelling at you, our costs are up 8%, and there's nothing you can do about that? Well, you start to underportion, right? Happens in the
Yeah.
bar too all the time, so a good piece of software will help you recognize that for sure.
Yeah, it's a really valid point because people like to hit targets. Right? They don't like to go into meetings every week. And I did a post on LinkedIn about how the P&L review's dead because how many people turned up to that meeting in fear, and all you wanted to do was drive results to be able to go in that meeting and have a nice hour where you're not being drilled by senior management. And you're right, people cut corners, people reduce portions. All of a sudden the product is being bought for a lesser price product that goes against brand standards, etc., etc. I guess we've probably all seen that in operations that have been done and can see it in if you go from one franchise to another in certain brands that don't control supply chain, you can see sometimes that local decisions are being made, and it's another good reason to use food cost variance because it doesn't put your teams under undue pressure of what's coming into the building. It's much more about what happens when it's in the building and the chef managing it through controls, isn't it?
Completely agree. Yeah. If they don't have the specific actionable insights and know how they can influence that number, they're just going to find ways to do it. And that's where it gets scary because then that becomes sort of a wild, wild west sort of situation where you're just kind of figuring it out, and that's, I think, the job of hospitality leadership, any business leadership really, is to provide the tools and the information to help someone succeed. And one final point on my end with regards to food cost variance with the group one of the groups that I worked with where we had really good success. All we did was started to just show the food cost variance. So before they would only have the actual food cost on a report, any sort of performance reports. All we did was rank each of the stores in this, whatever it was, 15 group, 20 group restaurant. We ranked all the stores on their food cost variance and did nothing else. And my only recommendation to the executive was just let them look at it, right? And naturally what happens, people are competitive, right? They look at the variance, they understand the tools they can use to impact it. And then just naturally, these teams started to work together to try and reduce that number. And we saved, I think with one group that I was working with, we brought the food cost variance down from 2.7% to like 1.75. It's like for this group, like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, right? So if it costs you $100 a month for the software per store and maybe $5,000 to implement, like, I don't know, it's like a no-brainer to me, right?
Yeah. I agree with you. I had a similar example with a group in Bahrain last year. 40 location. We put the system in, and within 1 month, it had saved 60 grand. So
Yeah,
again,
totally.
it was just literally by tracking it. All of a sudden, people were seeing invoices that were coming from friends that all of a sudden went back to suppliers, and it kind of seeing it all there. And like you were saying, just presenting the data sometimes is enough to make people think, actually, okay, there's some controls here now. Let's start really knuckling down. So yeah,
100%. Yeah.
it's an interesting one. The second one is a really interesting one. And to be honest, I came across it speaking with you and with Jim Taylor as well, who we both know, and that's labour productivity. And probably a lot of people are sat on the call right now going, no, labour cost is fine. We're good with labour cost. It's a good metric. Perfect. What would you say to those people about why productivity is a better metric than labour cost percentage?
We talked a little bit about, first of all, I do want to give a ton of credit to Jim Taylor. He's been working on this concept for 3 years. Amazing mentor of mine in this space. But yeah, labor productivity is so valuable because we were talking about actionable insights and how, with chefs with food costs, they would look at an average or actual food cost percentage and say, I don't know why it's going up. Right? The same is true for labor cost percentage. Labor cost percentage includes, 4 main variables, right? So you've got your average wage multiplied by your hours gives you your labor cost value. And then you've got your average check multiplied by your covers gives you your revenue, right? Hard part about that is average wage is very hard for a GM to influence. Like, yeah, can you influence a little bit? Sure, but you're not making like huge impacts to your average wage value, right? Most service-based employees, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but in Canada, North America, they're just getting the service wage, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, on the manager front, sure, there's a little bit you can do there. Overall, not too much. The second thing is average check. Can you influence that as a GM? Yeah, can, but by a very small percentage compared to what menu pricing initiatives do, right? So let's just assume for a moment that average wage and average check are 2 things that are very hard for a GM to control. Well, they're very big components of a labor cost percentage. So when we're talking about a number that you're trying to influence through tactical decisions that is also influenced by a bunch of things that are out of your control, you can see why a lot of operators say, I don't know, man, I'm going to try and get it close, right? And they start to make really poor decisions about how to influence labor. They're like, okay, well, we just got to cut way harder. And okay, but cut where? Cut who? Like, why are we cutting them? Like, what is there a service standard that we're trying to hit? How are we measuring that, right? So that's what labor productivity provides, is that when you think about what it is that we do, fundamentally as a service-based industry, we serve customers, right?
Yeah.
We don't serve dollars. So what I mean by that is if you had a group of 2 people come in and they spent 5 grand in your restaurant, and you knew nothing as an operator about what those people actually, like how many people were there that spent 5 grand, and you were asked to schedule for $5,000, you would go ahead and you would figure out labor cost percentage and schedule the number of employees, right? And then you figure out afterwards, well, there was only 2 people that came in, right? Now, this is obviously like a very random example, but you might have 7 servers on staff to serve 2 people because their average wage was just enormously high, or average check, I mean. So that's not what we do. When you look at a restaurant's dining room, for instance, what we're trying to do as management is we're trying to have an effective blend of the number of people in a restaurant serviced by the number of employees, right? So when you look at that, you come up with a metric, which is covers for every labor hour that you're using to service those covers, right? And those are the only 2 variables of labor productivity that that an operator should be burdened with, like, understanding and trying to affect, right? How many people came in? How many people did you use to try and service those people, right? And the nice part about coverage per labor hour is, number 1, it's very simplistic. Number 2, if explained correctly and visualized correctly in a performance report, it becomes very intuitive for a manager to see where in the day they're covers per labor hour is, starting to fluctuate. And it also makes it quite easy actually for a operator to start to record that in a manager logbook. So if you just wanted to just start tomorrow with labor productivity, is quite straightforward, right? You don't have to include average wage. You don't have to include average check. Those are very important, and labor cost percentage is important, but more from an executive standpoint when you're seeing how your profit has been influenced. But from an operator standpoint, hey guys, we're going to take out these things that you can't control, and we're going to just look at the two things that you can control. The one thing that you can control, which is how many people are you scheduling for the number of bodies in the restaurant, right?
Yeah, no, and I think you touched on some really valuable points, but probably the one that stuck with me throughout all of that was giving the teams metrics they can control. Because how many times through my career, I know for sure, and probably a lot of people watching, they had unachievable targets. They had things that were out of their control. Sometimes we needed more people, but couldn't get them because the budget said we had to have less. And I think that affecting that metric and throwing budgets and throwing targets out of the window is probably going to have a much bigger impact on your business because it gets engagement. And we all know that makes people perform better. And I think the old archaic way of doing a budget, it going upstairs, it coming back, an iteration, all the things that you talked about, which are all valid points. The workforce that there's now, they have so many things to navigate that probably I didn't have when I was an operator managing restaurants and what have you, in terms of fluctuations, labor costing, per person, the minimum wage increasing, the food cost increasing, all of these things have big impacts. And I think by being able to say to them, we understand it's not easy. So let's give you a metric that you can influence. One will show you care, which is huge for a business. Two, it's going to drive engagement, which then results in stronger performance, right? You must see it in businesses you work with, suddenly having a conversation with the chef where you're saying, I understand. Instantly, that kind of normal consultant thing of always coming here to give the people upstairs loads of tools to bash me with, it breaks down those barriers, doesn't it? And it just makes implementation much easier to do. I had a conversation with Bal, who works for me, a few weeks ago. He was going in to speak to a chef. And I said to him, just ask in one simple question, what are the three biggest pain points in your day? Or what are the three things that you get bollocking for in your day? And let me fix those first. And once I fix those, we can go on to the other stuff, because it's about really going into the people and saying you understand, isn't it? And I think that's what helps get those implementations over a lot quicker.
Totally agree. Yeah. In fact, like when I work with a group, the number one step for me with regards to creating a dashboard is to create a operator friendly dashboard first. Because what does anybody want? They just want results. They want more profit, right? Well, you're not going to get that from four people sitting around an executive table, talking about or inferring what's happening in the business, right? Like that's helpful to help set strategic goals, but what a lot of businesses I think are lacking is those tactical initiatives that are driven by operators with very good, like actionable insights. Like our cover per labor hour is worse, or it's the worst, Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Like that's the kind of information that we need. Your food cost variance is mostly driven by these 5 items. That's stuff that we need, right? To just look at it from a P&L standpoint and then like take sections of the P&L and put it into like an operator performance report is not helping anyone, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think if a operator goes into a performance review and they're looking at whether or not they're going to get their bonus, which is a whole other conversation on like, how to properly set up performance plans and bonus structures. But they should never be surprised when they come into that meeting. They should know exactly what metrics they needed to hit and what values, what targets they had. And they should have had that tracked and visualized for them for the entire period before they go into the performance review. So that the performance review is not about, okay, let's pull up your chart and see if you hit your numbers. It's more like, hey, I know I didn't hit my numbers, or hey, I know I went over my numbers for these reasons, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes much more like engaged, targeted, tactical, and that way when the operations, sort of the executive team comes down with strategic decisions, we need to increase or decrease our food cost by, a half a percentage point this year. The operations team can feel engaged with that because they have they can understand how to tactically initiate those objectives, right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. It's funny, there's probably people who I've worked with in the past watching this and kind of sitting here now going, I wish you had the same outlook now that you did a few years ago when I was kind of doing these P&L reviews and people were turning up with budgets and all the rest of it. But I think that's why I love to have these conversations now, because it is about educating what's always been done and starting to look at it to start doing things differently. And we're in a unique time where the tech in the industry is growing at such a rate that you can find cheap tools that can increase your performance of your business just by unlocking that data that sits there. And it's back to your point earlier where people were talking about ROI, people talk about cost. But if you take that risk and put it in a year's time with what you've saved, it would probably have a far greater ROI than the risk you take on Google ads and Instagram ads with no real correlation of ROI at the end of it. So you've got something that can deliver solid ROI in terms of what you've purchased, something that doesn't, and more often than not, people will spend that extra $100 a month on the Google ads, right? It's always one that kind of makes me laugh. I guess we've been talking now for about an hour. I just want to finish by having a conversation about the reasons why people don't use data or don't use some of the untapped data in the business. And I know this was one that you were going to throw at me at some point, but I'm going to start with you and then I'll give you my opinion. What do you think are the biggest reasons people don't use data in the business?
I'll start off with a great example. There's two groups that I'm speaking like in chats with right now, and both groups don't utilize any food cost reporting at all. They don't calculate theoretical, which means they don't have any insight to variance, nothing. To me, it's like you're sitting on $400,000 a year across all of your restaurants, right? $400,000 a year. There's nothing else that you could do in your business that will have a bigger impact than putting this in place, right?
Yeah.
To me, it's like the easiest decision that you could possibly make from an executive standpoint. And rightfully so. Well, I shouldn't say rightfully so, but I understand both groups have said we don't have the capacity to manage this project, right? Well, I mean, the benefit of working with outside help is that capacity doesn't need to be there. That capacity is part of like what I would do. And I know that's self-serving, but just let's say, for instance, that they would never want to work with a third party, so it has to be in-house. If you hired somebody at $70,000 a year to implement a food cost system, it would pay for themselves 5 times over, no doubt in my mind, right? It is the easiest investment that you could possibly make, but the capacity conversation comes up a lot. I don't have capacity. I think the second thing is not understanding it, right? I think a lot of owners shy away from data utilization because intuition is easy. They can still use their creativity. There's not any effort involved in intuition. It's like working out where a robot is moving your feet for you, right? Like there's no work you have to do. You're just using an opinion, right? Data takes work. It takes work. But I'll tell you one thing, the leaders in the restaurant industry currently and in the future will be those who utilize data most effectively.
Yeah, 100%. I would agree with that. And I think, if I was going to answer that question, I think it's just because a lot of people don't think about how they're going to use the data before they go into an environment, right? So before they go into a restaurant opening, they don't think about how they're going to use the data down the line in the operation, because they're already thinking about how do I get the restaurant open. And likewise, when I go into operations that have been running for a period of time, they're in that mindset of this is how we've always done it. And they're overwhelmed. They've got things going on, exactly like you said. They don't have the resource. They don't have it as a meeting agenda, and they don't talk about how they're going to use this data. It's just easier to say we need to increase food costs, we need to decrease labor costs, we need to do all these metrics. And I think I recently did an opening with a client, and before we opened, we had a conversation with the accountants when we were doing the tender process for accountants about having weekly calls and them producing data, because we knew the owners were not going to be able to do it because of overwhelm in the operation, weren't objective sometimes because there were too much in the operation. So we went in with a conscious effort to say, Mr. Accountant, every week we want to see these metrics on a P&L, and we want to be able to have a conversation around them for 1 hour every week and look at opportunities of how we can improve performance. And I think a lot of the time that is some of the reason is it's just not thought about until you come to do a menu change and you think, okay, I need to change the dishes that I'm selling, what's not selling. I've got a food cost problem. Okay, but how do I fix it? And that's when people want to unlock the data, when it should be the other way around, because it's much easier and much quicker to do it. Because when they're done, they give up and they just accept that 30% is the food cost for the business. And I had a conversation with someone the other day. We were laughing about it the other day and said we have a great food cost. I said, well, how do you know? Because you don't have anything that tells you if it's great. So in your mind, because of how it's always been, you think you're managing it well, but there might be opportunities sitting within there, and only by tracking food cost variance and doing proper stock takes would you find that. So I think, to answer my own question back, I think that's probably very similar to what you were saying as well on there. So it's a great one. I think we've kind of gone quite, we've talked for the last hour on this now, and I think we've probably given people some great nuggets. But if anyone wants to have a conversation with you about these in particular, or how you can help them put this into their business, how can they get hold of you? How can they reach you?
Yeah, I think the best method, the old school method would be email. So Derek, DEREK at canopymetrics.ca. But I'm very active on LinkedIn. So shooting me like a direct message on LinkedIn just to set up a meeting would be awesome. And I'm like self-admitted nerd when it comes to restaurant data. So if it's ever something that someone is just interested in talking about or wants to know more about, like it's not one of those things where it's like, meet with me and I'm going to charge you a bunch of money. I just love having conversations about it. So yeah, I'm always open to meeting new people.
And I think what I'd like to add on that as well is that borders shouldn't just be stuck in Canada when it comes to data, because data transcends across the globe, right? So if there's someone watching this in the UK that kind of thinks, I don't know anyone in London who could do this for me, data is numbers, and numbers are the same whether you're in Canada or the UK or the US or Australia, wherever it might be, I guess.
Well, I would say the same for you, Scott, because gotten to know you here over the last little while. You're a wealth of knowledge. So, for those that I know in North America, you're a fantastic person to reach out to on these topics for sure.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Derek. I hope this went okay, because it's the first time I've done LinkedIn Live, so you never know what might happen. But we had a great chat anyway. And if I did make a mistake, we're going to put the video on LinkedIn. We're going to put it on YouTube anyway, so people will be able to go back in and take a look, and we'll end the stream and see what happened after and go from there.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
All right.